Thank you
Yeah,
for
I'm
having me.
excited about this chat because it's all about strategy, which I would say is arguably the most misunderstood area in the world when it comes to business. So let's just get straight into it by defining strategy. How do you define strategy?
Sure. I define it as choices, making choices to do some things and not others. And I see it as an integrative set of choices that define where you're going to play and how are you going to win where you've chosen to play. Why it's misunderstood, I think, is it's become very much an exercise in planning. And strategy and planning are two different things, right? You can plan to do a lot of things, and you can have very detailed plans to do a lot of things, and you can do all of those things, and it still won't end up being a winning strategy. And I've, in my view, because planning is something you can be certain that you do right? As long as you're like dutiful and thorough, you'll have a plan. But to have a strategy that wins requires creativity. It requires trying to create a future that is better than the present. And that is not an easily doable thing. And so most people, most of the time, default to planning. And so there's very little great strategy done in the world.
And this is a big one, right? Because it is to choose like where to play. That's a big one, and how to win. Yeah. So it's those two things, right? And
that's the very hard strategy, I call it.
But what's interesting about strategy is that it assumes a competitor, right? It assumes there's a competitive landscape. Is that right?
No. I mean, many entrepreneurs create kind of a new where to play, and they win by being the only player on that field. So that sometimes happens. Now
that's accidental, though, right? That's accidental. They accidentally found a place where they could win, right?
Not necessarily. I mean, that's entrepreneurial beauty, is sort of figuring out some need that is not being met that you can meet, and now what tends to happen is that somebody will enter that space. I mean, if it's a really stupid idea and nobody's buying it and you're not making money, they'll leave you to it until you run out of money. But if it's clever and it turns out that people buy and you make a lot of money, then you can be sure others will enter and it will no longer be a monopoly. But I would just say it's not by definition you have a competitor. In essence, when you're developing something entirely new, right, the competitor is doing without, right? The very, very first car did not have a direct competitor, but it had doing without a horse-drawn carriage. And what you had to do is convince consumers to forego the current product, the current offering, and go with this entirely new thing, which is a challenge. It's a slightly different challenge than saying my car is better than your car, but it still requires you to have a value proposition for the user that causes them to choose it rather than something else.
So the where to play is the market segment, and the how to win is like how you're going to put all the resources together to focus on that segment. Is that the best way to think about it?
Absolutely. Though there are many sort of attributes to that market segment, right? You could say it's this kind of consumer, high-end or low-end consumers. You could say it's Australian consumers or American consumers. You could also say your where to play is what stage of the, if you will, the value system you're in. Are you going to be in the downstream part? So you're going to produce and market and distribute, or maybe you're going to produce and sell through a different distribution channel, or maybe you're going to backward integrate into the raw materials. So there are a bunch of different kind of where choices that get into it. But your idea of segment is not at all a bad description.
And
just
I'm
think
going
of where on the playing field, the entire possible playing field, are you going to plop yourself down and say, that is where I'm going to concentrate my efforts.
And we're going to get into all these parts, and I'm going to ask questions that may seem simple, but that's just how I work. Like, I like to just constantly check, is it like this? Is it like that? And if it's not, I'm not upset if you say, no, it's not like that. Okay.
Well, when it comes to strategy, getting specific like this is important because it's, again, as you said, it's misunderstood and done poorly generally.
Yeah. And so you talked before about strategy and planning. And like, I read in one of your posts on your 20-part series on Medium, which is highly recommended to anyone. Just check it out on Medium. 25 now, 25. Well, it was 20 parts and then it was 25. Excellent stuff. Sorry?
It's once a week. So as of Monday, it'll be 26.
Okay, it's once a week. Well, that's going to be the 13th book. You talked about there's a confusion between strategy and planning. And when people want to create a strategy, but it's a plan, they call it a strategic plan. Can you just kind of unpack that quickly? Because I know this will be happening everywhere.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's a general view that strategy is some kind of a cool thing. And so it's often used as a modifier to make something sound cool, right? Strategic sourcing, strategic procurement, and so planning sounds kind of boring. So call it strategic planning. And again, as I say in the piece you referred to, strategy and planning are complements, not substitutes. They're treated as substitutes. As long as we have a plan that explains the stuff we're going to do, we're going to call that our strategic plan. But unless it adds up to here's where we're going to play and here's how we're going to win, then it doesn't deserve the modifier strategic, because it isn't a strategy in the sense that I believe the term was coined. I mean, the term originally came from the world of the military, right? Which there's a long, rich history from Sun Tzu to Van Clausewitz of saying, here's the kind of techniques for thinking about how to win a battle, and we're going to call that military strategy, and that eventually got imported to business as this is our approach, our theory of the case that will enable us to achieve the thing we would like to achieve, and that's strategy.
Yeah, sure. And so just to clarify the first point, which was a strategy is a selection of the place to play and how to win. Yeah, so that's the first part. A plan is the list of things to do in sequential order to achieve something. And sometimes the confusion is just creating a list of things to do in sequential order does not mean it's a strategy, because you haven't chosen the place to play and how to win in that specific area.
You got it. See, these are not simple questions.
But I just wanted to clarify them, make sure I've got it, and also just for the listeners as well, right? And the second part, and this is
no, I was giving you credit.
Oh, thank you. I like credits. The second part was like, and this is just a quick side note because I'm interested specifically in this topic, but how does the military definition of strategy relate to the business definition, and how closely related are they?
Well, I think there's some kind of family resemblance, but they aren't the same thing. And in fact, right, the strategies evolved from away from military strategy, because if you think about military strategy and you ask what mattered in military strategy, what really mattered is us, so our capabilities versus that of the competitor, and what we were going to do, what they were going to do, and how those two things were going to interact. Now, there's a consumer, if you will, in the equation, only to the extent that if your military strategy is to respond to an attack on your homeland, then you're just going to assume the consumers would rather have you the consumers who are the citizens would rather have you repel the invader than not. You don't spend a lot of time thinking, well, do you really want, and what exactly would you like, and how? No,
Okay.
you just go do it. Or if you are the invading force, it's because your citizens have, in some sense, said, well, that's okay if you do that, or we'd like you to do that, or Parliament, approved it. So the consumer wasn't, and customer was not very much in the equation. But it was just assumed that you were doing something good for them. And the question was, can you beat the enemy? How do you go about doing that? Overwhelming force? You're going to be clever. You're going to outflank them. Whatever. And so, in the world of business, that's how strategy in many respects started, with very little concern for the customer. And it was, how would you get, in some sense, the father of modern strategies, Bruce Henderson, the founder of Boston Consulting Group, and his strategy was, you invest ahead of the learning curve, price ahead of the learning curve, below your cost if necessary, to get the dominant scale, so that your costs will always be lower and you will win. Right? That was it. The customer wasn't in that equation kind of at all. It was about you and the competitor and how you were going to get ahead of the competitor. As it evolved, it became more interested in the consumer, the customer. And that's where, in some sense, the where to play, or at least in my version of strategy, the where to play comes. It's like, it's like in the case of a country, it's sort of for all citizens. You're defending the homeland. No, it's for this set of customers. We want to tussle with the competition and then what they need, how can we serve their needs, etc. Yeah. So it's migrated away from military strategy in that sense. The other thing I would say about military strategy is it's a little more clear that there's a absolute winner and an absolute loser, right, at the end of it. And I see the evolution of business strategy more being I'm going to head over here, and these are my customers that I'm going to serve better than anybody else. And that'll cause you to stay away from those customers, because serving them does you no good, because you serve them less well than I do, and so I win.